shall we? Okay, hello and welcome to number 3 of our Mental Health Question Time events, brought to you by UCL Psychiatry, Lancet Psychiatry and the Mental Health. Thank you very much for being the serious and not fickle people who've come along despite it being rather a nice spring evening. We actually did sell all the tickets, so the number of people who are seduced by the weather seems to be quite considerable. So, I'm Sonia Johnson, I'm chairing this evening and I'm a professor in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL. I dabble a bit in the world of digital mental health via a study that's developing an app for self-management in psychosis and another study looking at an online support package for families of people with mental health problems. I think this is an incredibly important question because any of you who've ever been to any events or any online events around digital mental health will probably be familiar with the enormous chasm between the excitement and the feeling of innovation and of moving forward to a really interesting future at those kinds of events and day-to-day realities in the NHS, where if you can switch your computer on and manage to read your email, it's often a considerable success in terms of your digital life, and where people who you might assume by their age are digital natives seem nonetheless to be walking around with very small phones that you can't even access the internet on. So there's a huge divide between day-to-day reality in much of the NHS and the future that surely we should be moving towards now. We've got a fantastic panel to address these questions, and then we'll very much look forward to hearing from you what you think about how we can actually move forward to the digital future. We'd particularly love to hear from those of you who work in the NHS what you think can possibly be done to take the great leap forward to a digital future. So we're going to ask each of our panellists to speak briefly on their relevant thoughts on this question. I'll introduce each of them as they take their turn, and then after that we'll throw the discussion open to you and also hopefully to people out on Twitter. Hello everyone who might be watching the live stream, we're very pleased to have you, and please do tweet. I think Andre's picking up the tweets that come in on hashtag MHQT, so please do join us. Okay, so first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Victoria Betton, who's a very prominent leader in the digital mental health world in this country. She's a social worker who did a PhD focused on social media and mental health. Since then, her interests have widened to digital technology and mental health, and she supports innovation in a whole range of ways, including through leadership of the M-Habitat team, which supports development of a variety of technologies. She's particularly interested in co-production between service users, clinicians and developers. Other notable things are she has a particularly cute dog, which actually has its own Instagram account. So, Victoria, I'd like to begin by asking you, what kinds of approaches can we take to try and develop technology that actually gets used in the NHS front line?
Thank you very much for that, Sonia. I only have an Instagram account for BB, my pet's therapy dog, so I can mortify my children. So that's the one and only reason, and it does mortify them, which is very gratifying. Okay, so my first disclaimer, as someone sitting on this panel talking about the future of digital mental health, is that I'm absolutely no futurologist. I'm really rubbish at, in fact I'm a late adopter, if anything, in the field of most things. So I'm going to leave that to my fellow panellists, who I'm sure will have loads of good things to say on that subject. I think there's no doubt that cool technologies are most definitely going to feature in the future of mental health. But to be honest, I'm more interested in the how and the whom over the what. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to give you my prescription, my how and who focused prescription for a digital future for mental health. And first up, I'd like to make the point that I believe that digital isn't a silver bullet to an underfunded and overstretched set of mental health services. Sprinkling digital fairy dust on mental health services could actually be a bit of a rubbish distraction, or at worst, money thrown at shiny technology that just ends up lying on fallow ground. So a digital future that I want to see holds a healthy degree of scepticism. It doesn't assume that digital is the answer to everything, and it's open to the idea that sometimes digital might even be part of the problem. But what about how we should do it, how we should embrace digital in the future of mental health services? Well, a digital future that I feel hopeful about is one where tools and services are designed collaboratively with people accessing services, people living with mental health difficulties, and with practitioners, and one that solves real-world problems. Software development and human-centred design approaches bring a really super-duper opportunity to do things very differently. I've got a background in patient and public involvement in the NHS, and it was an absolute revelation to me starting to do work in the digital sphere to embrace those more participatory approaches which aren't that common in my experience in the NHS, but are much more rewarding and much more worthwhile. So in my digital future in mental health, digital is simply an enabler to doing stuff better than we do it at the moment. We don't talk about telephone-enabled mental health services or email-enabled mental health services, do we? We haven't quite domesticated digital yet, but I'm hoping that that will be where we get to over time. But it's not just about dedicated digital tools and services in mental health. For me, it's also about making use of the everyday. Mandy, not her real name, who we interviewed as part of a digital practitioner project, told us that her OCD means that she doesn't leave the house for days at a time. And she told us that without the internet, she would be dead. And that's a powerful thing to hear. And in my future, again, digital is just an enabler, but actually sometimes it's a life-saving enabler, and one that services and practitioners need to be taken far more seriously than they often are at the moment. So Andre asked me to speak briefly about the barriers, and well, we could just spend all evening talking about those. There are many and various, but our creaking infrastructure in the NHS is often a really big barrier. He also asked me to talk about what I believe is a bridge to a digital future. So my bridge is a big thumbs up to co-design and collaboration, and a big no to technological determinism, which does make it harder and more complex, but I think more worthwhile. And lastly, Andre asked me to talk to the role of safety and efficacy. And absolutely we need to be developing tools and services which are grounded in evidence and which are able to generate evidence as well. But as we test and iterate, we need to bake in the values that we care about: privacy, empathy, and humanity. And that's my challenge, I guess, to people in the digital sphere. So my digitally enabled mental health of the future is one with human values at the centre and one which is ethically orientated. It's one where technology may do the transactional stuff that frees us up to do the stuff that counts. And it's one where practitioners and organisations understand how Mandy and people like her use the internet sometimes to stay alive and are able to support her in doing that as well as she can. So those are my thoughts for a digital future, and thank you very much for your time.
Great start. Thank you very much. So our second panellist is Lisa Marzano, who's also deeply involved in the digital mental health world. She's an associate professor of psychology at Middlesex, and she's also the digital mental health editor of Evidence-Based Mental Health. And she has a programme of work that focuses on self-harm and digital tools that are relevant to self-harm. And Lisa, I'd particularly like to ask you to speak about an issue that's very often one of the first that NHS staff talk about, which is data security. So it often seems to really go against the grain when NHS staff who are used to very strong kind of data security safeguards in their everyday work, when you start talking to them about using apps and smartphones and technology that's well outside the NHS firewall, it often makes them very concerned. And what can we say to them?
My job tonight is going to be a bit of a killjoy in the sense that I'm conscious, and like many people here probably, I share the vision and the enthusiasm about digital technologies and digital enabled services. But equally, I'm going to sort of perhaps talk a bit about the pitfalls, perhaps not the pitfalls in the vision itself, but the pitfalls in where we are, perhaps compared to where we think. And if you think about, the vision, by 2020, NHS citizens will routinely make decisions about who sees their data with complete confidence that it's kept confidential, secure, and shared only when appropriate and for their benefit. I wonder whether we're quite there or whether we're anywhere close to getting there by 2020. And I think not a week goes by, sometimes not a day goes by, without the Internet of Things is, and also about information being shared about us in ways that we don't necessarily know about or don't consciously know about or understand. Lawsuits against Facebook being one of the examples of this. And of course this applies in all sorts of fields, and I have colleagues who are working in this in relation to child protection issues, and they're concerned about things like smart nappies and all sorts of other technologies. But I think they do apply very much in this field and in relation to the NHS. And examples are, only a couple of days ago, data from NHS staff in Wales was stolen. And we also know from freedom of information requests that the number of cyber attacks against the NHS and NHS Trust have quadrupled in the last 4 years or so. And these include sort of ransom type attacks as well as kind of phishing mails. And perhaps in my 5 minutes, which isn't very long, I won't go into discussing so much whether mental health is necessarily and always a special case in relation to these concerns, but I think it's worth considering the security concerns of people themselves who experience mental health problems. There was a study published relatively recently that showed that the biggest barriers amongst those who had psychosis and depression to using the internet were security concerns, and that about almost 50% of those who were asked about this mentioned security concerns specifically. And to some extent, we think these concerns, or at least I think these concerns, are funded to some extent in what we know about. Taking apps as an example, there was a relatively recent study looking at all health and health apps, so health generally, not just mental health. And of the 600 most common, what they found that only 30% had a data privacy policy. When we look at the NHS accredited apps, or the ones that used to be accredited by the NHS, that the percentage was higher, but there was still a third that didn't have data privacy policy. A more recent study, looked at apps that were for people with bipolar disorder, and what they found was that less than a quarter had published a data privacy policy. And I think that's too little. So I guess one question is, where does this leave us? And inevitably I started thinking a bit about regulation, and I promise I won't talk too much about that, or the legislation around it. And to some extent, as an academic, I think it's fair to say that for once, I can say academia is not the only one that's too slow in relation to technology, and that the legislation seems to be struggling to keep up to the speed of technology. And I think it's not just the rate at which apps, taking an example of apps again, are appearing on the market, it's also the speed at which they disappear. There was a study recently looking at apps for depression, and what they found was that clinically relevant apps seem to sort of disappear from the sort of app store at the rate of sort of 1 every 3 days, just under 3 days. So it's very difficult to sort of keep on top of what's out there and what their privacy concerns might be or not. So if our current system of regulation and legislation is struggling to keep up with what we have now, what are our hopes for sort of future-proof regulation and legislation? And I'm not saying that I don't think we can have a future-proof system, but perhaps that we need to be aware of not creating more burdens and opportunities, and also creating a system that's future-proof in relation to what we think, well, at least what I think, is relevant for the privacy of citizens and of those using technology. And there's a lot of controversy at the moment about the digital economy bill going through Parliament, and actually concerns that in relation to privacy issues, that might actually make things worse. So, there's data from the NHS being shared with the Home Office to track immigrants, etc. So, one minute, what was I saying? I think to have a meaningful, going back to your point, to have a meaningful discussion about digital privacy rights and responsibilities, we need to involve users, we need to involve a whole host of users, and we need to start thinking properly about, I think one of the issues that we don't properly understand or know, not just the technology and how it might go, but also its impact. I think it's go back to understanding what the effects of breaches in security might be, and not just from a sort of security and privacy perspective, but very much in terms of safety and potential for harm. And if I can just finish with a small plug about how important I think evidence is in this field, and how we, the Lancet Psychiatry, but also I'm section editor for evidence-based mental health, and we have a special issue that's specifically focusing on digital mental health. So this is very much the sort of submissions that we look forward to.
Great, thank you very much. Very important points, thank you. Okay, so panelist number 3 is Dr. Andres Fonseca, who's had a career which I don't think I know of anyone who's had a similar one. He's both a consultant psychiatrist and CEO of a software development company called Thrive, which develops apps for particularly depression and anxiety, I think, at this point. He also has strong links with the UCL Division of Psychiatry, where he has an honorary post. I have the pleasure of co-supervising with him a PhD student called Sasha Dalilina, who's here today, and I think my only claim for my 10-year-old son that I might be cool is the fact that I'm supervising a PhD on video games. So that's my final hope. So Andres, you've got extensive experience both with the health service and the digital world. How can we bridge the gaping gap between them and try and get some of the hundreds of thousands of digital tools that get developed actually used in practice?
Well, thank you for that. The real answer is I don't know. So, but let me try and help the discussion along. I think innovation takes a very long time. This is just the nature of innovation. So implementation. So even if you think of something like H. pylori clearly causes ulcers in your stomach, from that discovery to actually be routinely prescribed in clinical practice, 20 years. And this is something that we understand very well. So I think what can accelerate this, or what can help this, is a greater digital expertise in teams. I'm talking about CMHT level. I've always toyed with the idea of a digital pharmacist. In the same way you have an expert in pharmacology in your team that can advise you about the use of drugs, which is a form of technology. Can you not have someone that understands all these pitfalls and then recommends what is feasible and what is not, and what you should use and what you shouldn't? Because I have a background in development as well, I was keen to hear, or I was very pleased to hear what you were saying about co-development. What tends to happen is that either the idea comes from a clinical team, in which case it results in very poor user experience, in my experience, or it comes from a digital team that creates a very nice looking thing that is unsafe. They don't know anything about privacy, So those are the two pitfalls. So we need to integrate all this, not just with patients, not just with clinicians, but also cross-disciplinary with developers as well. I think, for me, I'd like to paint a picture of the future a little bit. So I think if we were able to be successful here, I would like to see a fully integrated digital layer with current services. It's cutting out. So if you think about Amazon, Amazon is not just a digital marketplace. It comes with a whole raft of all the things that are quite tangible. So it's got lorries that deliver these things. It's got warehouses. So it's not that it's just digital. It's fully integrated, completely. So that shows you that a digital tool by itself is probably not all that useful. I think it needs to be fully integrated into the way the services are provided. I think, in the future, we will see perhaps these tools being used for prevention and self-management on a population level. I think we can see some automated screening digital tools that will help people seek help at the right time. I think it will, recommend when you should escalate, and also when you're in treatment, it will help you remember those skills and use them to sort of continue on your recovery. I see an expert system that is not only helping the clinicians, but it's also helping the patients make informed decisions and empower them to sort of make the right choices for their care. I think the barriers at the moment is that from my point of view, there's no clear procurement level from an NHS perspective. There's no clear regulatory framework, and I think that is a barrier. That doesn't help anybody. So if it were clear, it would be much better. There's a lack of understanding and fear of the unknown from clinicians, mainly, not so much from patients. And I think there's a fear of losing jobs as well from the point of view of clinicians, that they think they're going to be substituted. Okay, and then you have classic, barriers to innovation that are common to any innovation. I think the things that make me hopeful for that future is that I think a lot of patients are digital natives themselves, and some clinicians are as well, and I think we have a grassroots movement that will help. I think you've spoken a lot about the risks, so I won't cover that. Again, I think it is right to be cautious, and it is right to sort of focus on security. It's also good to focus on bad advice, but we have all the sorts of bad advice that we try to cope with, like bad websites, bad books, bad services even. I think you need a correct appraisal of the risks versus benefits, and I think sometimes the risks are overhyped. And I think it's just, these are not toxic pills. So you need to sort of, the fear should not stop you from trying certain things, so long as they're safe enough. The last thing that I want to address is the research angle. So the thing that digital is so good at is agile. So what you do is agile development. What that means is that you reiterate on your design very rapidly. So you learn what works, you learn what doesn't work, just because people are using it. You see what they're using, you see what they're not. So there's no research design that accounts for that or allows that. So I think we need what it looks like in practice to me is a series of RCTs. So if there was some research methodology that could address that way of doing it, so it remains agile, but it also remains safe and it remains efficacious, that would be the dream.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, panelist number 4 is Mark Brown, who's another well-known leader at the intersection of mental health and innovation. His experience includes editing One in Four magazine, a publication for people with mental health difficulties by people with mental health difficulties. And he's development director for Social Spider, a social enterprise which is commissioned to do a variety of innovative research, writing and development, particularly in the voluntary sector. So Mark, just to ask you, does it really matter if all this digital stuff, it seems pretty difficult to put into practice, does it matter if it remains a bit of a niche thing for people who are really interested in getting involved and have the relevant skills and experience?
Well, I'll tell you, if my microphone's working all right, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me at the back? Go on, give us a wave. Fantastic, that sets my mind at rest. It's a really good question, which hopefully some of what I've written in preparation will be able to answer. First thing I want to say is we're in the middle of the biggest rollback of public spending in generations. In the form of Brexit, we're embarking on the biggest experiment in leaping into an economic and geopolitical unknown that our country has seen in at least a lifetime. In mental health, we can assume that the world we see around us will always look much the same as it does now. That institutions like the one we're sitting in now will always be here. There will always be an NHS. there'll always be social care, there'll always be human rights, there'll always be helplines, there'll always be homes and jobs and opportunities. I think right now we can assume no such thing. This might sound alarmist, but in mental health we've been always too complacent, too cautious, and too ready to accept that things will turn out all right, contrary to what we see and know every day in our work. Life for people with severe and enduring mental health difficulties has been getting worse. This is what makes our job right now in mental health all the more important and desperate. Right now, digital technology is one of the areas of exploration where the promise exceeds the probability in mental health. In much of the rest of the adult mental health world, our possibilities are plateauing, either because we have run to the end of possible ways to wrestle anything better from a discovery or a practice, or because public and political will to provide the resources to fully use something to change people's lives is flatlined. There is nothing traditional on the horizon that is going to save us from failing people with mental health difficulties in future in worse and more painful ways than we already fail them. Digital technology is one of the areas where there are new frontiers to be explored, potentially in ways that avoid the existing strictures that prevent more traditional means of helping people have better lives to increase how much help they can provide. Digital technology creates hybrids. It takes the things we already know how to do in one area and finds new ways of doing them. As such, digital technology is our best bet for better mental health because we already know a lot about mental health. And other people know a lot about tech and also make a lot of money out of getting that tech right. So we're halfway there. The direction of travel is that there will be more breakthroughs in research in digital technology every year, which means if we can carve a space for mental health, in that we will reap the benefits of a direction of innovation that is already unfolding. So we have the grounding in theory to shape the technology into something transformative and caring and sustaining for mental health. We need to get out there, and we need to get messy, and we need to get building and talking and gossiping and breaking in the understanding that a lot of things won't work on the path to finding what does. If you do not let yourself travel close to the edge of your domain of interest, you will never see the domains that neighbour it. Safe in the capital city of mental health, where the streets stay familiar and the sound of change hasn't brought angry voices out to the barricades, you will be able to comfortably assume that nothing will ever change. You will never see the winter coming, and the winter is coming. In large parts of the world, though not everywhere, we're in the age of ubiquitous computing. People carry with them the most amazing, powerful, tiny computers in the form of smartphones. We tend, if we're not careful, to see these as little tiny computers that are just vehicles for information or apps, but they're much more than that. They can process information, they can collect data, they can receive and they can broadcast, they can overlay one reality on another, and they can take phone calls as well, sometimes. People choose to carry these amazing devices because they love them and because these devices both make sense in their world and make sense of their worlds. To play it with William Gibson quotes, which is one of the things that brought us here tonight, the streets find their own uses for technology. People are already using digital technology in amazing, nuanced, inventive and shocking ways, and we know next to nothing about that in mental health. We do not know how people who experience mental health difficulties and distress actually use technology now. We occasionally recruit 30 people and ask them if Facebook makes them a bit sad. We occasionally prod some people into a room and then show them a bit of digital technology and tell them that they should like it. We keep asking the arse about face question, what is digital technology doing to our mental health? When we could be asking, what could digital technology be doing for our mental health? A colleague said to me that when you're developing technology, or indeed anything in health or social care, you're always building on a greenfield, you're never building on a greenfield site. You're always building on reclaimed brownfield land. There are always neighbours, always NIMBYs, always hidden deposits of gas, uncharted subterranean catacombs. Making something new is all about barriers. It needs to be all about barriers if you don't want to kill someone, or if you indeed do want to kill someone, if you think about it. Regulation and safeguarding is important as the way that information is prevented from causing harm. We need to use that as a positive force, not a negative one. So we have two tasks, should we choose to accept them. The first is to immerse ourselves in technology and its possibilities, to look at how we can make technology happen, how we can marry it with mental health knowledge and mental health needs. The second mission is actually to understand how people use technology now and how they might use it in the future and what that means for how we need to make things that will work for them. Right technology, wrong user experience is the same as wrong technology. understand people's interactions with digital technology, and you'll understand how to put life-changing technology in a form that will work for them, not against them. Right, I'm Breathe, so I've been quite quick there. So if you missed all of that, I will summarise. The TLDR here is things are looking a bit shit in general, and are looking really shit for people with mental health difficulties. So we all have a moral duty in mental health to make sure that digital technology isn't shit too. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great deal to think about. So next is Puffin O'Hanlon, who's one of our fantastic research workers in UCL Division of Psychiatry. Her interests are in development and implementation of digital interventions for psychosis, and she's currently working with me on a study that's led by Fiona Lobban in Lancaster, investigating the challenges involved in implementing an online carer support package called React. So Puffin, what is it really like trying to get digital innovations adopted in mental health services?
It's a challenge, and I hope to talk a little bit about why. But first I'm going to go back in time to my first experience of implementing digital technology, which was a painstaking but ultimately successful 2-year campaign to get an Apple Mac into my family home. My dad wrote his books with paper, pen and Tipex, and my mum ran her business filing system on index cards until 2012. Technology had no place in the arts of writing or dressmaking. Happily, both mum and dad have now harnessed digital technology, but only as they've learnt how WhatsApp, online banking and birdsong apps help them to be better connected to friends and to family, more efficient in their daily routines, and better bird watchers. I've worked on several studies now, developing and implementing apps and online resources for early intervention in psychosis services. We're still collecting data, so I can't spill too many beans, but I can share some of my experience from the Great Digital Mental Health Leap front line. It seems that the majority of NHS stakeholders, unlike my mum and dad, are already active users of digital technology to varying degrees. But some of the key challenges in mental health services are a little bit similar. The resources fit with context and values and priorities. In the NHS, challenges remain in improving access to digital services and systems, developing innovations that fit with service user and staff routines, skills and goals, and building trust in and enthusiasm for digital interventions and innovations in mental health contexts. So firstly, the devices. Access to digital devices, as we've heard from other members of the panel, in NHS services is patchy. And it can be difficult to imagine a digital future when you're holding a Nokia brick in your hand. When developing the My Journey app in collaboration with early intervention staff and service users, a very first hurdle was that staff couldn't actually access it on their work dumb phones. So while trying to, another example was trying to demonstrate the interactive features of our React online toolkit, which is a psychoeducation and support tool for early intervention service relatives. NHS Trust Wi-Fi blocked inbuilt videos of users sharing their experiences, zapping the real life out of the intervention. Slow connections and clunky laptops led to frustration in staff's training sessions, and none of this is really conducive to enthusiasm or involvement. And it's important to remember that while smartphone ownership continues to increase, there are significant minorities who don't have easy access to digital technology, and it's an inequality that seems to run along more traditional lines of marginalisation. We need to think about how to ensure access for all, to ensure that the digital leap in mental health care leaves no one behind. So secondly, the digital misfits. To be useful, used and effective, digital technology needs to fit. It needs to fit with people's daily routines and ways of working, and it needs to make tasks less time-consuming, more effective, or enable new possibilities. In one NHS service that we were working in, all staff have been given iPads, and they've had them for a couple of years now. It was assumed that they would take them up and use them to engage with clients through the new React website. The iPads were provided for staff to use a new app for out-of-office access to trust IT systems. A minority of staff now use the iPad enthusiastically in their work with clients, making activity diaries, watching YouTube videos, using Google Maps, or doing mindfulness exercises. But the majority of those iPads remain in the cupboard where they were tidied to over a year ago. They became digital misfits. The iPads didn't fit with the staff skill sets. Having been trained in the app and not the iPad, many staff lack the skills and the confidence to use it. Moreover, seemingly small details of the app design didn't fit with existing IT systems, a mismatch that made tasks more time-consuming and led to disillusionment. So even with the best intentions, a lack of fit can arise from the very smallest detail, which is why it's so important that digital interventions and innovations are developed with the intended users, NHS staff and service users. They are the experts in the rhythms, the details and the priorities in their daily lives. Okay. So finally, the narrative. There are pockets of digital enthusiasm, and there seems to be a general recognition of the potential benefits of digital interventions. But again and again, I've heard variants of "it's better than nothing," or "it can't beat sitting down with a real person," or "is it going to take my job?" The narrative isn't universal, but it does seem to be pervasive. It's something like this: while digital interventions may have their uses, they are essentially second-rate, low-cost, externally imposed substitutes for face-to-face support. And it's difficult to get really, truly enthusiastic about second best. It just feels too much like we're giving up on receiving or providing high-quality care. So I think we need to know a little bit more about where this narrative is coming from, and what's maintaining it, what its impacts are, and how it might be challenged. Is it a lack of resources, disillusionment, an assumption that certain people, older people perhaps, people with mental health problems, can't or won't use digital technology effectively? Or is it influenced by a belief that when it comes to mental health, human contact is always best? 1 minute's running up. Okay. So my opinion from the front line is this: we need more investment in digital resources. We need user-centred design of interventions and innovations to ensure that they fit usefully into people's lives. And we need more evidence of effectiveness, of course. We need more real-life feasibility and implementation research to find out how best to harness the digital revolution to empower and enable people in their daily lives. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so last but certainly not least, Dr. Geraldine Strathedy is a well-known force of nature who needs little introduction to many of you. Perhaps one of her most important roles has been her period as National Clinical Director for Mental Health in NHS England, but she's had many other clinical and leadership roles in her career. She describes herself as a baby boomer early adopter who's in a polygamous relationship with the Alexa app. Do you know what that is? I looked it up, so I'm impressed. So Geraldine, you're last, perhaps because you're famously positive and inspiring, can you persuade us that it's all going to be all right and that we should just get on and get the digital technologies going and not worry too much about these barriers?
Thank you very much, Sonia. Can I ask anybody else in the audience who would identify themselves as a baby boomer to put their hands up? Okay, great. There's about 4 of us. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm here because I have one aspiration left for my life. So a couple of years ago, I was in the States and there was a lecture given by a Dakota Indian elder who just happened to be a High Court judge as well. And he said the most valued, honoured position in the Dakota tribe is the history carrier. I aspire to become the NHS or the kind of the mental health world history carrier. Because what I'm going to talk to you tonight in my 5 minutes is 3 things. One is, how can we make it all right? Given Mark's, I think, heartfelt plea that we have got to use this as a way to make it better for people with mental health problems. How can we get the basics right? How can we get the bravura? How can we actually change the entire course of mental health problems by using digital? And finally, I'm going to tell you about my generation. I'm sorry there's only 4 of us here because we are going to bankrupt you guys. We are the people who have multiple morbidities. We're ending up in your hospitals. We're taking the money out of your treasury. You have to listen to what I'm saying. Right. So let me start with the basics. In 1982, when I was an SHO, Senior House Officer, I did a study on a medium secure unit in mental health where we shared the records, paper records, with the patients. And every day we co-produced the care plan. And there was shock horror. I remember in Guys, people saying, oh my God, there'll be absolute violence, the notes will get ripped off, people will be kind of running around. And actually, it was one of the safest medium secure units, with people feeling much more able to get on with the plan, much more owning it, and they could go forward. What are we today, 2017? Where in the country are people able to look at their records and do something with them? And the person who is most, I think, inspires me most is Amir Hanan, a GP up in Oldham, of all places. High deprived Oldham, 40 languages spoken in his practice, and 78% of the people from that highly deprived area, including particularly people with mental health problems, with obstetric things, are having access to the records in his practice. Why don't we make that basic human right to feel empowered, to understand and see your own information? Why don't we make that a big priority? The second basic I want to talk about is, why are we doing any of this digital anyway? Now there's the bravura bit about this is fun and sexy and interesting, but what about the basics? The basic fundamental problems that have not gone away in mental health and are getting worse is the 20-year premature mortality of people, particularly with psychosis, who are dying not because they need to, but because of profound neglect of their physical health. Why can't we just use the digital world to sort that? E-diagnostics. GPs introduced electronic care record systems in the kind of 80s, where basically they could remind people to come for appointments, they could ask for blood tests online and get the results back. Why can't we just do that? Why can't we make that a priority? Last Friday, I chaired a whole day session on electronic prescribing. Because again, that's another huge third big problem. 60% of us do not take medication as prescribed. Those of us who have 4 children will testify to that. So 60% of people do not take medication as prescribed. 80% of people, when they become mentally unwell, it is often because they've not remembered the medication. I sat in a room with innovative, developing, fantastic digital ways to prescribe people last Friday. Every single one of the organisations involved were doing the same thing. They were developing 1,500 templates of what should the good prescribing look like, what reminders should people get, what safe effect monitoring should people get. Why are we doing this? 56 times in 56 trusts, developing 56 times 1,500 templates just to get the basics of prescribing right. Let's get real. And the final thing I want to say is we talk a lot about not being able to engage people, and I loved your story about the iPads, but I remember the 3rd time in my life, 1988, I supported the HIS electronic care record system. Went nowhere. Then I went to the Maudsley. We had the Maris system, £9 million later, still no electronic records. In Oxley's, I think it must have been about 2000, 2003, we said we're going to get electronic records. We are really going to crack this digital world. And we had loads of staff. We had 2,000 staff, and at least 1,800 of them were probably quite cautious about turning on a computer, let alone using it. A genius manager I work with, she had the answer. She said, it's all about people, isn't it? So we asked this staff, how many of you would love to be able to order your shopping online? Have you heard of that? Ordering your holidays online? How many of you have teenage kids having to do a project for the GCSEs? We are going to let you and teach you every lunch hour between 12:30 and 1:30 to access the records. And basically, within 3 months, the entire organisation was committed to records. So my final bit about the baby boomers is this. Please don't neglect us. We are the generation that is costing you a fortune if you don't get it right. But the good news is we are up for it. We are the generation that invented the Beatles, Men on the Moon, psychedelic colours. We love the zany music. I hate Alexa, but get it right for us and we will stay fit and fabulous and we will help you. But, the other thing she says, we have the money to buy your digital innovations.
Great. Thank you for that final challenge. Could someone give Niall a microphone? This is. Yeah.
Okay, is that
on.
it's
Yeah.
working?
So
Great.
Niall Boyce, editor of Lancet Psychiatry, now has the roving microphone.
Okay.
Your questions
So,
and comments.
yes, question. So for the Q in MHQT stands for question, and a question, for the purposes of tonight, is a short statement followed by a question mark. So if anyone has one of those in their head, could you just put your hand up? Great, we got one right at the front.
Hello, thank you very much for coming tonight and sharing all your thoughts and experiences. So my question is, RCTs, despite being amazing and knowledge-based as they are, do you think that they actually lag behind technologies in the NHS? And actually, if you wouldn't use RCTs, psychiatry in the NHS will be able to keep up with the existing trends. Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Who would like to speak to that? Lisa, do you have any thoughts?
This is on. I agree. I think RCTs are important, but I don't think we only need RCTs, and perhaps we need to have RCTs for ways of working, models of working, types of intervention, rather than specific apps or services that become obsolete by the time that the RCT's results are published. So there are alternatives. Actually, people who are working in health, UCL has a quite big centre of behaviour change, and they focus more on sort of anti-smoking, smoking cessation apps and exercise apps, etc., etc. But there are lots of interesting discussions within that field, perhaps more so than in mental health, about possible alternatives or sort of more agile ways of evaluating sort of rapidly evolving interventions. I also think we should use single case experimental designs a lot more. I mean, the sort of technologies we have mean that we can have a lot of data, in fact sometimes too much data, from a single individual. So why not track the progress of specific individuals and learn from that, rather than trying to necessarily have control groups, which sometimes can be tricky in relation to these areas anyway.
Just to say that we're working with Mindtech, who some of you might know, so they're a health technology cooperative based at Nottingham University, to develop a pragmatic evaluation framework for mental health digital tools that a software developer can pick up and make sense of. But we've also found in Toronto a PhD student who's developing an evaluation methodology to align with agile software development. So we've made friends with her and are very interested in finding out more about what she's doing and how we might be able to collaborate with her in the UK.
I think it's kind of interesting thing with evaluating specific apps or specific services, about the question about whether you're trying to evaluate a principle on which something works or the particular product itself. It's kind of like when you're testing chemical compounds, those chemical compounds tend to remain the same regardless, how you deliver them. Whereas I think in digital technology and mental health, there's sometimes a confusion between what you're doing is you're testing that bit of software
or you're trying to test the underlying principle upon which it works. And that's often where you end up with that kind of graveyard of dead trials, where you go, we tried this app, it didn't work, therefore we must never ever explore the principle behind that app in any other way. I think there's kind of interesting thing there, which is maybe slightly different from what you're asking.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
thanks. We have another question over here.
Hi there. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on the importance of differentiating according to diagnosis, because sometimes mental health is discussed as like one size fits all, but obviously it's the efficiency and effectiveness will really differ between different diagnosis groups. I think particularly people with social anxiety will benefit, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Very interesting. So I think sometimes diagnosis itself is of limited value when you're trying a digital product, and you're trying more to try and adapt to the personal characteristics of the individual and their individual needs rather than necessarily on what are the presenting symptoms. Because a lot of what you're doing is self-management, so you're managing a chronic condition, and there's a lot of principles that apply across the board. And then you probably try and personalize more on the individual rather than on a diagnosis. And there's good evidence that transdiagnostic approaches, for example, transdiagnosis CCBT, works very well. So you don't necessarily need to pay so much attention to diagnosis, it's more attention to the person, I think.
I'm just going to say one very quick thing, which is yesterday I was at the launch of the Slow-Mo app and the evaluation of that. And this is an app that is about cognitive thinking, and it was really working on the principle that people who are feeling paranoid are thinking very fast, making very quick decisions, acting out very, very quickly. And I sat there thinking, this may work for people with paranoia, but my God, wouldn't this be brilliant in policy and parliamentarian circles, so that we could stop the initiativitis that gets in the way of us consolidating some of our rules.
By the way, people on Twitter, I'm watching my phone for your questions if they have hashtag NHQT at the end. Okay.
Okay.
Next.
Yeah, we have another question just here.
Digital health isn't cheap. It isn't cheap to develop, and more importantly, it's not cheap to continue to maintain, to keep developed, to keep up to date. I don't see a kind of way that the NHS is doing this. I think it's Andros's kind of point about procurement. And I've got a specific kind of question that came up in relation to another digital event as to whether advertising is something that the panel would consider, because that's a lot of how we do pay for things as consumer through what we don't pay for things, they're free because there's advertising.
Anyone want to respond to that?
Is Simon here? Simon gone. Simon's gone from PhD. I think, funnily enough, I was running a workshop yesterday on adoption of digital within the NHS and sustainability models. And we were talking about the different sort of models that are around, and in-app advertising being one of them. I think there are some issues with clinical safety around advertising, actually, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be a no-no in the future NHS app endorsement sort of process that comes our way. So, yeah, I think it's problematic. But the whole thing about how you sustain digital tools, and definitely in our experience, we spend a lot of time trying to encourage people not to develop stuff. But I think people often underestimate the initial cost of developing a digital tool and then the whole life cycle cost of a digital tool and how on earth they're going to host, do the technical support and the upgrades and development. So I think there's often some naivety from within the NHS about what's involved over a period of time.
I very much agree with that. I don't think we would ever use advertising at all. I mean, I cannot imagine a scenario. The way you target advertising digitally is by knowing who the person is looking at the advertising. So it is about data, so immediately we've got a problem there. So, I mean, we would never consider that form of doing it. But there are alternative business models that you have to explore. I mean, for example, from our point of view, we try not to get the person that ultimately receives the service to the cost. So there's various ways in which you can do that. Through the medical insurance, there's various ways. I think the approaching the NHS is a bit difficult, but there's all the ways, all the business models that work and that eventually get the thing free in the hands of the individual, which is the goal. Yeah.
I wonder whether people think there's also a point to be made about commissioning, that at the moment commissioning is all on a sort of local or regional basis, and maybe that doesn't really work for commissioning digital tools. Would you?
Well,
yeah.
I would definitely agree with that. That's why we never do that, because it doesn't work.
And although we're probably not going to get RCTs in apps, for instance, one of the things which strikes me as a publisher of mental health research is that there have been so many pitfalls identified and safeguards put in terms of the pharmaceutical industry being involved in healthcare. And I hope that we learn from the principles of that in terms of digital innovations of the future.
I think one of the things I wanted to say is that I don't think we should just be talking about mental ill health. We should be talking about developing mental health. And I think a lot of people would pay for understanding much more about how they can actually build their own mental health. Employers are increasingly understanding the benefits of investing in the mental health of their employees. So I wonder if we should be looking at, I've always personally thought that we should in organisations be looking at an income generation stream, which is about the creation of fitness, and people who can afford to pay baby boomer generation to actually help support the development of things for people that have developed ill health and probably can't afford to pay.
You should mention that is exactly my business model.
Okay, we have another question down here.
This is great because it actually follows on to the conversation. But so my question was around, I think it goes back to Andreas, your point on procurement by the NHS. So I work in a startup doing exactly what you do by the sounds of it. So we serve corporates with mental well-being services. And I used to work for the NHS and wanted to work for them as a startup, but I can't because of practical issues around funding cycles that are too slow. So our cash flow dries up. Sorry, this isn't a question, is it? I'll finish up. So my question is, do you think the NHS is doing enough to encourage digital innovation from startups? And if so, what are they doing? If not, what can they do further? I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Thanks.
The next person with the question is right in the middle of the row, so you can take your time answering this one.
Just to kind of share a bit of an experience of being in a team, trying to collaboratively design an app and going in with ideas of agile principles and wanting to be quite open in what we were proposing. But actually going through NHS procurement, which is what we did, we needed to give an exact specification of the end product, which of course kind of went against all of the principles in the research for asking people what they wanted, testing it, developing it, changing it. So that's a kind of personal experience.
Can I just add an alternative experience? Sorry, Mark. Working with our procurement team in Leeds, we did manage to do some procurement for outcomes rather than procurement for a specification, because that's what absolutely kills a project. Like you said, you need to bring the domain experts together with the software developers and the creatives and the designers. That's where the magic happens, when you bring them together. If you get a clinician with a functional spec, it's just going to be a disaster. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting sort of question around sort of public sector investment in this, because there's a way in which public sector investment has often managed to kind of socialise the risk of something not working, but privatise the profit when it does work. So we haven't quite got to the model where we can say with confidence that as government, as people, we will make the decision to invest in these things and share equally between the producer and the investor the profits of doing so. I think this is a really difficult challenge for states who kind of say, just give me a grant here, a little bit here, there, and then say, oh, well, it failed. The taxpayer will pay for that. When it succeeds, the IP becomes mutually transferable. So the example of that Google stuff with the patient records, if you remember that, which was excellent, we would give you a very, very small app for looking at kidney disease, and in return for that we'll get to look at 30 years worth of a gazillion people's health records and analyse it any way that we want. I don't think the UK taxpayer got a great deal out of that, to be honest. But it's kind of quite high level discussions about where the money for things to happen comes from. I think which are always kind of really difficult. I think we can keep going on about NHS procurement, but I think that actually the problem is closer to being around investment and where the investment comes from to meet the very specific needs that in mental health, people with mental health difficulties have that aren't really particularly sexy to investors at the moment. And the question of where that money comes from to answer the problems that people who aren't cared about very much by people and who also generally tend to earn about 25% less over their lifespan. The question of where the money comes from for to meet their problems is one that I don't think we really answer. So there.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much for very interesting presentations, especially the last one. I'm very much for making the patient's records available easily. For some reason there seems to be some kind of big, close-up on those. So as a counsellor, I've got some kind of a worries, if you wish, and namely the quality and validity of digital services. And what I mean by that is, first of all, can digital services really be as effective as real lifetime, interaction, human interaction? And also, who is going to monitor the standards? Who is going to set up the standards of the quality of those services? And by validity, I mean, of course, there are loads of people who are literally housebound due to their mental health problems. However, I'm thinking, would those services create even more justification to remain in the house rather than make an effort to kind of surmise the problems?
So is the worry that Catherine spoke about really, is this not a rather inadequate substitute for human contact? Anyone like to say something? Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting sort of point there, that if we're talking about people who are unable to leave their home for one reason or another, wouldn't it be really awesome if we could free up more resources to go and see them by not giving face-to-face services to people who didn't want them? It's a horses for courses thing. So some people would love a phone call, some people would like a Skype call, some people would like a text message, some people would like a robot to give them a hug. I don't know, lots of people have lots of different things that they worry about or dream about. There's a question about whether we can use digital technology to move the existing resources we have around in the system, which we probably still do have. We have a kind of pooled system of resources, sort of, just about, kind of. So whether you can move the resource from one place to another so you can meet the needs of people better. I think what we often do is we set off talking about digital technology to solve the problems of the people it's least likely to help, because they're the ones that are currently in the most need.
No, I mean, I think it was just exactly to echo that point. Is I think there's some people who find telephoning and digital much easier than face-to-face contact, and that may be at a point in their system, whereas other people the most important thing in the world. So I don't think we can legislate for individual people. And I'm kind of with Mark. If you think about particularly frail elderly people who are so isolated, suicide rate really going up in that group because of isolation. Can just even Skype contact and having somebody, if they can't travel long distances in rural areas, can we at least use digital to prioritise that group, put them in contact? And we don't need to do it as a one-to-one, we can set up peer support systems.
Can I just add briefly that I agree, and I would also add that there is a risk of just thinking of digital as one thing, and of course there are different models of developing sort of digitally enabled care. Some of them might be standalone self-help sort of apps, but others are very much kind of in a blended care model of thinking about things, and I think they are very different, and it's difficult to sort of talk about them as one thing, just in the same way that it's difficult to talk about people as preferring one model as opposed to the other. So I guess it depends.
Okay.
Okay, we'll have one question from the audience, and then I wonder if you can see if there's anyone on Twitter who has a question.
I have been watching it.
Okay, so we'll go for this question, then we'll go for a Twitter question.
Hi there, I've really enjoyed the presentations. Feels like there's a slight bias or interest towards sort of addressing a specific mental disorder like self-harm or psychosis through apps, and less discussion around just promoting general well-being. And the reason I say that is because mental health issues are on the rise, so everyone is more and more at risk of mental health issues than they were previously. So the question...
Prevention.
Yeah, to prevention. So the question is, given increasingly people are actually meeting their mental health needs in their own ways, so they're finding their own apps, or they're having their own Instagram page where they share their sexual abuse through fashion and then have loads of followers. People are coming up with sort of creative and very individualized ways. And at the same time, private companies are collecting a huge amount of data on human beings, their likes, their dislikes, their problems, their feelings, their emotions. How can clinicians and the NHS keep up with actually a sort of autonomous and very sort of company-driven model that's actually sort of leaping ahead actually of where the NHS is at?
So again, I guess it brings us back to our starting point, which is of the wide gap between what life is like in the NHS and the digital innovators who seem far away from that point. I think we're coming to the end of our discussion, and perhaps we'd use that to just ask all of you on the panel to come up with, I'd just really like a sentence from each of you about what you think the most important change or the most important innovation might be to try and take at least a bit of the digital leap forward, or at least a digital small step forward towards the different future when you finish.
Well, we've touched on all the frustrations and the constraints within the NHS, which are, as I said in my talk, many and varied. And I do think we've got to get some of those, sort of, whilst we're sort of floating up there, looking at all the magical possibilities, we've also got to be thinking about that sort of infrastructure. And part of that, for me, is about building the digital confidence of health and care practitioners, and to enable them to have the sorts of conversations that you're maybe referring to, which is enabling people to keep well online, use the internet to promote resilience rather than to maybe be unsafe. So for me, there's something really important about how we work with health and care practitioners so that they're able to think about that blended online and offline lives that we have, and how they support people to live well and have that in their background consciousness in everything that they do.
Brilliant. That was actually just one sentence, so well done. Quite long. Okay.
My one sentence, which won't be one sentence, I think we need more evidence, and I think we need better evidence, and I think we need to be a bit cleverer about how we gather our evidence and what kind of evidence we gather, because we risk being too slow otherwise.
For me, it's about, I think regulation is very important, and I think we need regulatory clarity so that when we develop something, it meets those needs, we know it's safe, we know we can put it in front of people and help them.
Stop talking about digital as magic. Talk about digital as a tool that might meet a need that you have as a part of the toolkit that includes other tools and devices and people.
I think we need to understand a lot more about people's digital lives, both staff and people who access services. There need to be conversations and collaborations that harness the way that people are using technology already and the ways that people live their daily lives, so that we can really enable the development of interventions that are different and complementary to face-to-face support, not a kind of second-best alternative.
I think I'd just say, why don't we just crowdsource the entire mental health world and ask them what they think the biggest basic priority should be that digital can solve, and then demonstrate that that works by using some kind of great evaluation, because I think that would save lives and take us further forward much, much faster.
Okay. All right, many thanks to our fantastic panel. I think the discussion's been a very rich source of ideas. Thank you very much also to all of you for coming, despite it being a lovely evening, and to all of you who've listened or participated online. Next MHQT will be in July. The date is, can anyone remember? Well, we'll tell you, in July, on women's mental health. So we hope to see you then. The 5th. Brilliant. Thank you very much.